Imagine walking into work and being told that your biggest professional success today depends on saying something that half the audience might hate, the other half might misunderstand, and everyone will be discussing tomorrow. Oddly enough, for a certain kind of television, that's not a nightmare, it's the job description. Yet here's the strange part. The jokes that create the loudest outrage are rarely the ones that reveal the most about society. The bigger story often isn't the punchline at all. It's the invisible machine behind it, the writer's room debates, the network standards, the audience expectations, the internet backlash, the uncomfortable truth that comedy has become one of the places where people argue about politics, morality, culture, and even history without admitting that's what they're doing. That raises an interesting question. Why has a 5-second joke become capable of generating week-long headlines? How did late-night comedy evolve from light entertainment into something that critics, politicians, journalists, millions of viewers treat almost like a nightly political event? And perhaps most importantly, what happens when audiences stop asking whether something is funny and begin asking whether it should have been said at all? Comedy has always enjoyed a curious privilege. A politician who delivers a controversial statement might spend days explaining it. A comedian can make a similar observation in 15 seconds, shrug, and say, it's a joke. Except, increasingly, that explanation satisfies almost no one. Supporters insist critics have lost their sense of humor. Critics argue that calling something a joke doesn't magically erase its impact. Meanwhile, social media happily transforms both sides into trending hashtags before lunch, and that's where things become fascinating, because the modern comedy ecosystem isn't just about making people laugh. It's about navigating expectations that often contradict each other. Audiences demand honesty but dislike being the target. They praise fearless satire until the joke lands a little too close to home. They celebrate comedians for telling uncomfortable truths, right up until those truths become personally uncomfortable. That contradiction has quietly become one of the defining characteristics of modern entertainment. If you look back several decades, television comedy generally occupied a simpler role. Variety shows, sitcoms, and stand-up specials certainly pushed boundaries from time to time, but audiences largely understood the arrangement. The comedian exaggerated reality. The audience laughed. Everyone went home. Today, that arrangement feels almost quaint. A joke delivered during a live broadcast can be clipped, uploaded, translated, reposted, criticized, defended, fact-checked, and transformed into a cultural debate before the performer has even left the studio parking lot. Context becomes optional. Timing disappears. The internet rarely waits to discover whether a joke was building toward a larger point. Ironically, technology has given comedy a permanent memory, even though humor often depends on fleeting moments. Consider how differently jokes function depending on where they're heard. A line delivered inside a comedy club arrives with an invisible agreement between performer and audience. Everyone knows they're attending a performance designed to surprise them. The same sentence appearing alone on someone's social media feed can feel dramatically different. Without tone, facial expression, timing, or surrounding context, humor sometimes resembles evidence more than entertainment. And suddenly, people aren't debating whether the joke worked. They're debating the person who told it. That shift has changed the incentives for everyone involved. Television networks must balance creative freedom against advertiser concerns. Streaming platforms enjoy fewer traditional restrictions but face instant public scrutiny. Creators constantly ask themselves whether an idea is genuinely funny or merely shocking. Sometimes those overlap, frequently they don't. There's another complication that rarely receives enough attention. And comedy has always depended on shared cultural knowledge. A joke referencing current events assumes viewers understand those events. But modern audiences consume information through wildly different lenses. Two people watching the same headline may arrive with entirely different assumptions about what happened, who was responsible, and whether the media can even be trusted. Imagine trying to write a joke that both audiences find clever. Good luck. The result is a fascinating evolution. Rather than simply commenting on events, Many comedians now end up commenting on the arguments surrounding those events. In other words, the joke isn't always about the news anymore. Sometimes it's about how everyone reacts to the news. That subtle shift matters because it changes the target of satire. Instead of mocking only powerful institutions, modern comedy often examines the audience itself. Our habits, our outrage cycles, our willingness to share articles we haven't read, and our remarkable confidence in topics we researched approximately 14 seconds before posting online. Human beings have always loved certainty. The problem is that certainty spreads much faster than nuance. Nuance rarely fits inside a viral clip. Comedy, however, occasionally sneaks nuance into conversations people might otherwise avoid. A carefully constructed joke can expose contradictions that a straightforward lecture cannot. By laughing, audiences sometimes acknowledge uncomfortable truths before realizing they've agreed with them. Of course, power cuts both ways. Humor can challenge prejudice, but it can also reinforce it. It can question authority or lazily recycle stereotypes. It can encourage empathy or simply reward cruelty dressed as confidence. That's why discussions about comedy become so heated. People aren't merely evaluating craftsmanship, they're evaluating values. And those are two very different conversations. Think about how often someone responds to criticism by saying, "You just didn't get the joke." Occasionally that's true. But sometimes people understood the joke perfectly and simply disagreed with what it was trying to accomplish. Understanding isn't the same as approval. Likewise, disliking a joke doesn't automatically mean someone opposes free expression. Unfortunately, modern online debates often reduce complicated disagreements into imaginary teams. Either you're defending comedy itself, or you're supposedly trying to eliminate it forever. Reality, as usual, refuses to cooperate with that neat little storyline. Comedy has survived wars, censorship, changing governments, technological revolutions, and countless predictions that people can't joke about anything anymore. Curiously, people have been claiming that for generations, which suggests one of two possibilities. Either humor is constantly dying, or humor has an extraordinary ability to reinvent itself whenever society changes. History strongly favors the second explanation. Every generation believes previous comedians enjoyed unlimited freedom while current performers face impossible restrictions. Yet earlier eras had their own invisible boundaries, subjects that broadcasters wouldn't touch, sponsors wouldn't tolerate, or audiences considered unacceptable. The lines moved, they always have. The difference today is that millions of people witness those lines moving in real time. Sometimes they're pushed deliberately, sometimes accidentally, sometimes by a joke that wasn't even expected to become controversial. That's another overlooked reality. Very few comedy writers sit around trying to predict next Tuesday's outrage cycle. They're usually trying to solve a much simpler problem. Is this funny enough to survive live television? Oddly, that's often harder than producing controversy. Offense is easy. Surprise is difficult. Originality is even harder. A truly memorable joke usually combines all three while saying something audiences hadn't quite noticed themselves. Those moments become classics because they reveal rather than merely provoke. Unfortunately, algorithms don't always distinguish between insightful comedy and inflammatory noise. They simply reward engagement. Whether viewers are laughing, arguing, praising, or furiously typing in capital letters, the system frequently reaches the same conclusion. People are paying attention. From the platform's perspective, emotional intensity often matters more than emotional direction, which creates an uncomfortable incentive. If outrage generates visibility and visibility generates revenue, then everyone's definition of successful comedy quietly begins shifting, not necessarily toward better jokes, toward louder reactions. That's where an artistic challenge slowly transforms in an economic one. Comedians aren't only competing against one another anymore, they're competing against endless scrolling, against breaking news, against viral videos, against sports highlights, against celebrity gossip, against your cousin posting photographs of an unusually large sandwich. In that environment, subtle observations can struggle to compete with explosive headlines. So creators constantly face temptation Should they pursue the thoughtful joke that earns quiet appreciation, or the outrageous moment guaranteed to dominate tomorrow's conversation? The question doesn't have a universal answer. Some choose restraint, others embrace escalation. Many attempt both simultaneously. And audiences often reward whichever approach confirms their existing worldview. Which introduces another paradox. People frequently describe comedy as fearless truth-telling, yet the most commercially successful material often tells audiences what they already suspect. True surprise carries risk. Agreement feels comfortable, but genuine satire usually asks viewers to laugh at themselves as much as everyone else. That is considerably harder to sell because almost everyone enjoys satire until they become its subject. What makes all of this even stranger is that the battle over comedy is almost never about a single joke. It feels that way in the moment because headlines need a simple story. Comedian sparks backlash fits neatly on a news site. Millions of people disagree about the cultural role of satire in a rapidly changing information ecosystem does not. It's technically more accurate, but it has all the excitement of reading the warranty on a microwave. The reality is that every controversy is usually carrying several different arguments at once. One group is debating taste. Another is debating ethics. Someone else is arguing about politics. A fourth group is discussing free speech. Meanwhile, thousands of people are simply enjoying the spectacle of watching strangers argue online. In other words, people often believe they're participating in the same conversation when they're actually having completely different ones. That helps explain why so many debates about comedy never seem to end. Each side thinks it's answering the other's questions when in reality they're responding to different concerns altogether. Take the idea of offense. On the surface, it seems straightforward. A joke either offends someone or it doesn't. That quickly becomes more complicated. Almost any joke somewhere in the world is likely to offend somebody. The more interesting question is whether offense alone tells us anything useful about the quality of the joke. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. History is full of comedians who challenged powerful institutions and offended the people those institutions represented. Their work wasn't remembered because it was offensive. It was remembered because it exposed hypocrisy, contradiction, or absurdity that audiences had overlooked. At the same time, history is also full of jokes that relied on easy stereotypes or cheap provocation. Those often generated attention too, but attention isn't the same thing as insight. If a joke merely shocks people without revealing anything new, it tends to have a surprisingly short shelf life. That's one of comedy's least appreciated qualities. Truly memorable satire usually ages better than outrage. Think about the pieces of comedy that people still quote decades later. Rarely remembered because they insulted someone. They're remembered because they captured a larger truth about politics, bureaucracy, technology, media, or human behavior. The laughter came from recognition, not simply surprise. Recognition is a powerful force. People enjoy feeling that someone has articulated something they've sensed but couldn't quite express themselves. That's where comedy and investigation begin to overlap. Both involve noticing patterns that others have ignored. The investigator asks, what's really happening here? The satirist asks, does anyone else realize how ridiculous this looks? Sometimes those questions lead to the same place. That overlap has become increasingly important in an age of information overload. Every day brings hundreds of headlines competing for attention. Most disappear almost immediately. A handful dominate public discussion for a week. Very few remain culturally significant a year later. Comedy operates inside that whirlwind. A writer may spend hours crafting a joke about a story that audiences completely forget 48 hours later. That's an unusual creative challenge. Unlike a novelist or filmmaker, comedy writers often work against an expiration date measured in hours. No wonder the process can feel frantic. But speed creates another problem. Complex issues rarely become simpler when compressed into 30 seconds. Consider how often major public debates involve trade-offs rather than obvious villains. Technology brings convenience but raises privacy concerns. Artificial intelligence increases efficiency while creating uncertainty about jobs and misinformation. Scientific breakthroughs solve problems while introducing entirely new ethical questions. None of these topics fit neatly into heroes and villains, yet public conversations often try to force them into exactly that framework because conflict is easier to communicate than complexity. Comedy faces the same temptation. It's much easier to mock an individual than an entire system. Systems require explanation. Individuals require only recognition. Audiences instantly understand a familiar public figure. Explaining why a complicated institution behaves the way it does takes far longer. The challenge then is resisting the shortcut. Strong satire doesn't merely point at a person and ask the audience to laugh. It asks why the circumstances existed in the first place. It shifts attention from personalities to incentives. That's a subtle but important distinction because incentives shape behavior more consistently than intentions. Suppose an online platform rewards content that generates intense emotional reactions. Creators quickly learn, whether consciously or not, that emotional intensity increases visibility. Over time, more creators begin producing emotionally charged material because the system encourages it. Nobody has to issue a memo saying, "Please make everyone angry." The incentives quietly accomplish the same thing. The same logic appears across industries. News organizations compete for attention. Social platforms compete for engagement. Entertainment competes for viewers. Everyone insists they're simply responding to audience demand. They're not entirely wrong, but audiences also respond to what they're repeatedly shown. It's a feedback loop. The system shapes preferences, and those preferences reinforce the system. That's why it's rarely enough to blame individuals alone. Individual choices matter, but they occur inside environments designed by countless other decisions. Comedy often exposes those environments more effectively than straightforward reporting because it highlights contradictions rather than merely describing them. A well-constructed joke can reveal an incentive structure in a single sentence. Of course, constructing that sentence is far more difficult than it appears. The audience sees 10 seconds. The writer may have discarded 50 alternatives before arriving there. Even then, success isn't guaranteed. Humor remains stubbornly unpredictable because audiences aren't equations waiting to be solved. They're collections of experiences, expectations, cultures, memories, and assumptions. The same joke can produce roaring laughter in one room and uncomfortable silence in another. Neither audience is necessarily wrong. Simply bringing different contexts into the experience. That variability frustrates people searching for universal rules about comedy. There probably aren't any. Instead, there are principles. Caxits matters. Intent matters, impact matters, craft matters. None of those factors automatically overrides the others. They exist in constant tension. And perhaps that's exactly why comedy continues to fascinate us. It refuses to become entirely predictable. The moment someone announces they've discovered the formula for being funny, another comedian breaks it. The moment someone claims nothing can be joked about anymore, the performer finds a brilliant new angle that audiences enthusiastically embrace. Comedy survives because human beings continue producing contradictions faster than anyone can write about them. Modern life is exceptionally generous in that regard. We worry about digital privacy while voluntarily sharing our daily routines online. We complain about misinformation while forwarding headlines we haven't verified. We insist algorithms shouldn't influence our opinions immediately after allowing recommendation systems to decide what we watch, read, and discuss. It's difficult to imagine a satirist running out of material anytime soon. The bigger challenge may be choosing which contradictions deserve attention, because behind every trending controversy lies a quieter question about how society is changing. Those quieter questions often matter much more than the loudest argument of the week. Which brings us to another issue that deserves far more attention than it usually receives. Not whether comedy can change minds overnight, whether it slowly changes the questions people are willing to ask in the first place. That's a much subtler influence, and arguably a much more powerful one. The loudest joke may dominate today's headlines. The smartest observation may quietly reshape tomorrow's conversation. The final piece of the puzzle isn't whether comedy is becoming more dangerous, more restricted, or more influential. We've started expecting it to do jobs it was never originally designed to do. Think about everything audiences now ask from a single late-night monologue or satirical segment. We want it to make us laugh. We want it to explain complicated events. We want it to expose hypocrisy, hold powerful people accountable, reflect our values, challenge opposing viewpoints, remain factually accurate, avoid unnecessary harm, surprise us, and somehow still fit into a few minutes of screen time. That's an extraordinary list of expectations for an art form built around timing and perspective. In many ways, comedy has become a mirror that people expect to function as a courtroom. We don't just watch jokes anymore, evaluate them like arguments. We don't simply laugh or groan. We dissect intent, examine wording, debate consequences, and sometimes assign broader cultural meaning to a sentence that took only seconds to deliver. That doesn't mean audiences are wrong to think critically about what they hear. Quite the opposite. Humor has always shaped conversations, and thoughtful criticism is part of any healthy creative culture. The interesting question is what happens when every joke is treated as if it were a policy proposal. Comedy thrives on exaggeration. Investigation thrives on precision. Satire lives somewhere in between, borrowing from both. It stretches reality just enough to expose something genuine hiding beneath the surface. But if every exaggeration is interpreted literally, satire begins losing one of its most useful tools. On the other hand, if every joke is automatically excused because it was only comedy, then satire also loses credibility. The shield that blocks every criticism eventually becomes indistinguishable from an excuse. That's the balance creators continue wrestling with. The strongest satirical work tends to understand that balance instinctively. It doesn't demand immunity from criticism, nor does it surrender to the fear of disagreement. Instead, it accepts that meaningful commentary often creates uncomfortable conversations. Those conversations are where audiences become participants rather than spectators. Notice how the most memorable satirical pieces rarely provide neat solutions. They leave viewers with sharper questions. Why do certain institutions reward behavior that almost everyone claims to dislike? Why do outrage cycles repeat with remarkable consistency? Why are people so quick to assume the worst intentions of those they disagree with while generously interpreting the mistakes of those they support? Those aren't comedy questions. They're human questions. Comedy simply provides a different way of asking them. Perhaps that's why satire has remained relevant across generations despite enormous changes in technology and media. Newspapers gave way to television. Television expanded into streaming. Social media compressed discussions into clips measured in seconds. Artificial intelligence is beginning to reshape how information is produced and consumed. Yet the underlying challenge hasn't changed very much. People are still trying to understand one another through imperfect communication. Sometimes that communication takes the form of investigative journalism. Sometimes it's an academic paper, sometimes it's a speech, and sometimes it's a joke that for a brief moment reveals a contradiction everyone recognized but nobody had quite articulated. Those moments are surprisingly valuable because they create shared recognition. Even people who disagree about the conclusions may recognize the observation itself. It's a rare achievement in an era where attention is fragmented and consensus often feels elusive. Of course, not every attempt succeeds. Some jokes miss the mark because the premise is weak. Others fail because timing overwhelms substance. Occasionally, the audience simply isn't ready to hear the point being made. Failure has always been part of comedy. It's also part of investigation. Every worthwhile investigation begins with uncertainty. You gather evidence, challenge assumptions, test competing explanations, and remain willing to revise your conclusions when new information appears. The same mindset benefits audiences consuming satire. Rather than immediately deciding whether a joke deserves applause or condemnation, it helps to ask a few additional questions. What observation is the comedian actually making? Who or what is the intended target? Does the joke expose a contradiction or merely repeat one? Does it encourage people to think differently? or simply reassure them that they were already right. Those questions don't eliminate disagreement, they improve it. And better disagreements are surprisingly important. Healthy societies rarely eliminate conflict. Instead, they develop better ways of handling it. Humor can contribute to that process by lowering defenses, exposing absurdity, and encouraging curiosity, provided it remains connected to genuine insight rather than empty provocation. That's why originality matters so much. The easiest joke often relies on familiar assumptions. The more difficult joke challenges assumptions, including those held by the audience itself. That requires confidence from the writer and trust from the audience. Neither comes easily. Perhaps that's why truly memorable satire feels increasingly rare. It's difficult to create work that is simultaneously funny, thoughtful, surprising, and durable. Chasing viral attention is much easier than earning lasting relevance, but lasting relevance has an advantage that viral moments rarely possess. It survives changing headlines. Years from now, most of today's online arguments will be forgotten. Trending topics will disappear. Platforms will evolve. New technologies will introduce fresh anxieties. Public figures will come and go. Human contradictions, however, remain remarkably consistent. We'll continue balancing convenience against responsibility. We'll continue confusing confidence with certainty. We'll continue searching for simple explanations to complicated problems. We'll almost certainly continue laughing at ourselves, even if we don't always realize that's what we're doing. In the end, the biggest story was never about whether a particular joke crossed an invisible line. Those lines have always shifted with culture, context, and time. The more enduring question is why those moments matter so much to us in the first place. The answer seems to be that comedy isn't merely entertainment. At its best, it's a form of observation. It notices the gaps between what we say and what we do, between the ideals we celebrate and the habits we practice, between the stories we tell ourselves and the realities we eventually have to confront. Those gaps are where satire lives, not to provide all the answers, not to win every argument, but to remind us that certainty is often less valuable than curiosity, that confidence is no substitute for evidence, and that sometimes the quickest path to understanding begins with something as deceptively simple as a laugh. When that happens, the joke has already done something much bigger than entertain. It has invited us to look a little more closely at the world and perhaps a little uncomfortably at ourselves.